Hi, my name's Eric. I'm the director of the Rewilding School, and thank you for joining us to talk about invasive species for Invasive Species Awareness Week with the Lewisboro Land Trust. A lot of people talk about invasive species being big and evil and sometimes demonic, um, but and other people talk about invasive species as a totally natural part of the ecosystem. Leave plants alone. Don't vilify any plants. And the reality is somewhere in between. And to start us off, before we start talking about any plants, let's put some definitions out there. One, a native species. A native species is a plant or an animal that evolved as part of the ecosystem and contributes to uh, the ecological continuum in that space, in that habitat. Now, there are plants that are introduced to an area. A plant that is introduced means that it did not evolve locally in that habitat and did not start off as part of that ecosystem. And plants like this go one of three routes. One, they're not successful, and that's about 90% of species that once they're introduced to a place, they don't survive. They can also become naturalized, which means they do enter the ecosystem and over time they become part of the ecosystem without doing harm. They don't do harm, they don't take over. And then the last category is invasive species. Now these are plants or animals that enter an area and do harm to the local ecosystem, disrupting habitats, removing important native species. It creates a very challenging place for local flora and local fauna to survive. And so when we start talking about invasive species, it's a very small subset of plants and animals that do harm. We're going to look at a few different plants and animals today that are now common in our area, but are acting very invasively. And you should keep an eye out for them in your yards and your wild spaces. One common invasive species in the lower Hudson Valley is known as mugwort, or Artemisia vulgaris. This plant right here grows commonly in all kinds of habitats, but predominantly open spaces, old meadows and abandoned fields, things of that sort. What makes this plant so destructive is that it grows as a monoculture, or it pushes out all the other plants, making it the only plant in an area. It does this by having extensive root systems, and it's also allelopathic, or it produces poisons that prevent other plants from growing. So I'm going to turn this camera around so you can see just how extensive this patch of mugwort is. So you can see here, this is a farm field that's been abandoned for a few years now. And almost everything that you see is mugwort. So this is another invasive plant. This one is known as Japanese barberry. Japanese barberry is a bush with a round leaf and thorns and red berries that are often used in Persian cooking. Now, Japanese barberry, when you scrape the bark, has a yellow tint underneath. And by itself, Japanese barberry looks pretty innocuous. It's a low-growing shrub. Unfortunately, when the birds eat the berries, they spread them through the woods, causing this little thorny bush to become highly invasive, covering our forests. Now, what's really destructive about Japanese barberry, in what humans really care about, is that it harbors ticks. Areas that are infested with Japanese barberry have many more ticks that often carry Lyme disease than areas that do not have any Japanese barberry at all. This next plant is a common one at the edges of forests, also in lawns, in deep woods, any place where it can get started. Garlic mustard is also allelopathic, which means that it produces poison that pushes other plants out. And it can dominate a landscape, making it very difficult for young trees and wildflowers to get established in areas. Now, garlic mustard has a 2-year growth cycle. What we're looking at here with these spiky bits up top are its 2nd year. We're going to flip the camera around so you can see 1st year growth and identify it before it goes to seed in your yard. This is a first-year garlic mustard plant. Garlic mustard has this classic heart shape with a rounded edge, or rounded lobed edge. All of the veins are coming out from the center point. Another invasive species that's common to our area now and recently started invading the lower Hudson Valley is emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer came here a few decades ago in shipping crates over from China. Now, in China and Korea, where the emerald ash borer is native, it has regular predators that keep it in check. When the emerald ash borer came here, it found our ash trees to be absolutely delectable. Unfortunately, we don't have any natural predators of the emerald ash borer here that can control its numbers. And so it's been killing off almost all of our white ash, blue ash, green ash, and black ash trees. First of all, you know you have an ash tree when the bark makes these A patterns. Now, an infected tree will often have these oval holes that are where emerald ash borer comes in. And they are a little bit smaller than, excuse my dirty fingers, I was just gardening, they're a little bit smaller than a fingernail. Prior to death, a lot of times they'll have what's called blonding. And you can see that here, where you have woodpeckers that try to eat the larval emerald ash borers, and they start taking away the bark of the tree. If you do see this, don't cut down your tree. That encourages the spread of emerald ash borer because they will flee the dying tree. All of the species that we're talking about here today are already established in our region. They're not going to disappear entirely. You can manage invasive species on your land and your wild spaces. And if you do that, that makes it possible for other native species, which are more beneficial to the ecosystem, to survive and thrive on a local scale. And all conservation starts locally. We're going to take a look right now at some plants that you can put in your yard to help encourage native insects, native pollinators to come in and replace invasive species that you might remove from your yard. So this is elderberry. This is a great replacement for barberry when you pull it from your yard. Right now, in early June, it's in flower. You can see those amazing flowers here that are going to open up to a beautiful white. Pretty soon, those flowers are going to turn into berries, which are really useful for birds on their migration as a calorie source. Elderberry will grow to a bush about 7 to 10 feet tall and about 6 to 8 feet wide. It is a beautiful space-filling plant that gives you enjoyment year-round. This is Canadian anemone. It is a beautiful flowering ground cover, and yes, this does fill in absolutely wonderfully. You can use this to replace mugwort or garlic mustard once those are removed.